Hey there, Golden Bears. How are we today? I hope you're keeping it classy like I know you always can and will and do. Today we pick up on life on the home front. In our last episode of 7.9, we learned that it just wasn't one event, namely the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that triggered America going into the war. In fact, there were a lot of factions that kind of says, let's not do this. But ultimately, it was the Pacific Amphitheater that pushed us over the edge to convince and convey to America that we're going to join the battle. Today, we're going to look at how did the battles of World War II affect the home front, namely mostly the minority groups and the women and the marginalized people of America. So this is a really important theme. So I hope you tune in, put that little proverbial seatbelt on, and hang on for your dear life. There's a quote here that FDR made in one of his State of the Union on his third election to president. He says, "This is the way to fight and win a war, all out, and not with half an eye on the battlefronts abroad and the other eye and a half on personal, selfish, or political interests here at home." He was talking and sharing how America had not been split with regard to why we should be at war or how we should be going at war, but that everybody has to be willing to set aside their personal interests in order to win the war. And so this is a theme that he is going to talk about often in his third term as president, and a theme that almost everybody in America recognizes that they need to do in order to bring about the victory. This is part of the graphic organizer assignment that you'll need to do, and it's basically comparing the social unrest movements of post-World War I, and then what some of the social unrest movements were happening right now in the midst of World War II. And why is it that these social conflicts, racial conflicts, keep happening across the American landscape? So that's something you'll be looking at as we unfold. Well, my story today goes back, of course, to my age days growing up in high school. I'm continually trying to find stories that identify and resonate from my age when I was in high school to your age presently. And if you've been paying attention, you knew that I came from a family where my dad owned his own business, but it was a janitorial business, and it wasn't at all anything that I bragged about or talked about or made known too much. That we had this side business, to kind of bring in extra money, and I'm grateful for my parents and working hard and extra hours in order to do this. But boy, I disdained every Wednesday evening, every Friday night, and every Sunday morning, afternoon, we would go and go do our cleaning of these different doctors' offices. And I only prayed and hoped, I hope none of my friends drive by and see me. I hope. And now it's not like my parents, they paid us to do this. And so we always had spending money and were able to go out and do things. But really cleaning, moving vacuums around and dusting tables. And this is back in the day when people smoked inside. And so cleaning ashtrays, it was just doing whatever we could, at all costs to help the family and ourselves. Well, I got tired of that. And so going into my junior year, I says, "Dad, I'm tired of doing the toilet thing. It's embarrassing and being janitors." And he says, I get it. Well, you go out and look for another job and you're going to make a lot less than what I pay you. I'm all, "Yeah, Dad, but I just want to have like a normal high school job." "All right, I get it." So my friend Joe, I said, "Joey, what's it like working at your job?" He goes, "Oh, it's great. People come and go." Basically, it was like an AM, PM, but a drive-through. And I might have talked about it in prior stories, but people would drive in and say, "Hey, I want the milk, I want the bread, I want Twinkies and a gallon of ice cream." And we would go grab it, come back, and talk about one little sidebar here. We had to get pretty good at memorizing what the prices were, and had to get pretty good at memorizing what the products were on the shelves. And then 3, how to make change from our head. Because they would hand us a 10 or a 20, and we had to, if we wanted to save steps from going back and forth 15 times, this is all old school. You had to, take the order, go get the stuff, come back, collect the money, go to the register, come back again. And if you had a line of 10 people out the back, you're like, how can I make this faster? So, pretty quickly we learned to make change and carry change and do all sorts of things to kind of quicken the pace while we're there. But anyhow, that's a sidebar for those of you who haven't learned how to make change yet. my dad's advice to me when I did get this job opportunity working at Sunup Drive-Thru, it was called, and he says, son, whatever you do, don't ever sit down on the job. You don't know who's watching. You don't know who's coming by. You don't know if the assistant manager's there. You know. I says, Dad, okay, I got it. He goes, no, seriously. Always look for something to do. Go into the cooler, restack food products in there. Always be out front sweeping. Always, dust the things. Okay, always stay busy. Sure enough, the first month or two, I'm there working with my friend Joe, and Joe's all, Doug, why aren't you just chilling? I go, well, dude, because my dad says, to always kind of keep busy. So pretty soon I saw Joe kind of doing some of the same things. And so about a month and a half into it, Judy was the owner's name, and she was in there. And I asked her if I could meet with her. And I go, Judy, hey, I was wondering if I can get a little bit of raise. She goes, Doug, I am so proud of how hard you work. I've been hearing from the other people in store manager that you're doing great. Yes, I'm going to give you a quarter raise. Now, my friend Joe had been there a year longer than I had, and he never got a raise. So he went and took, the gumption, and she goes, okay, sure, Joe. I was waiting for you to ask. But, at all costs, we were invested into that. Well, why do I share that story with you? Is because this is the approach that FDR and Americans had to make, is at all costs, whatever it takes, we need to do what it takes in order to defeat not only Germans and what they were doing in Europe, but now the Japanese and what they had done to the Americans there in Pearl Harbor. So with that, let us dive in. Manage the home front economy. Of course, we have to recognize that, remember, we're coming off a depression. And so what the federal government needed to do is they needed to begin spending money in order to fuel the industrial giant, or the industrial complex, it's called. And so Roosevelt did a huge amount of billions and billions and billions. I'm talking like $340 billion. In fact, I believe they spent more money in gearing up just for World War II than they spent on World War I, okay? And so what did this unprecedented spending do? It fueled an economic growth, productivity, and employment. Growth in terms of industries that went as far as to West California. You can see that in the bullets down below. West Coast, we had Los Angeles growing hugely. You have Long Beach, of course, including that. Then you had Seattle, you had Portland. Why were these western gateways so important? Because they were the closest to the Pacific Amphitheater, or the Pacific War, to where the boats and the planes needed to go. Plus, West Coast, Best Coast, Joe, if we create, I think we made over 16,000 planes during this time period. This created major jobs out on the West Coast, but after you build them, you got to go fly them. No better place than where the weather is better than there here on the West Coast and Best Coast. We see farming expanding and growing and making more money than ever before, because we're now growing not only for the soldiers in America, but we're also growing for people in Europe in order to keep them sustained. And then we see industries that were kind of hurting and groaning and in pain during the Depression now revitalized in the Northeast and the Midwest. And instead of making cars, they're making tanks and other military things. I mean, I think we made 16 million rifles, I think we made in this time period. I mean, it's an insane amount of things that America was doing with how our government and how our industries were now seen as collaborators rather than, the enemies in this time period. Well, in order to help facilitate this, President FDR had to pass the War Powers Act, which enables him to basically go around and pick and choose which industries need to become federalized. So, of course, you need to federalize the transportation industries. You need to federalize the railroad industries. You need to federalize the airline industries. You need to federalize anything that involves with production of planes, and to the production of military goods. And so what made this unique is that in order to take them over, the government says, look, we're going to teach you how you can bid, and this bid is going to be, you're going to charging the government more money for what it really costs you to make that, but you're going to also learn how to cut costs. You're also going to learn how to pay less in taxes. And so really what this was a great combination between the two agencies working together. And ultimately, who paid for all of these things was, yes, our tax dollars and war bonds, but it got them working together rather than working apart for something that was incredibly needed in order to be part of the war effort. And then we have the War Production Board that determined what the economy and how it should run, very similar to what they did in World War I. And then we have the military-industrial complex, where you begin seeing the cronies of Wall Street working together with the cronies of the military, and they recognize one can't do without the other. Each of them have to scratch their back. You know, who's the yin and who's the yang? They're bothly needed. And so what you begin to recognize is, how is this different than socialism, where the government controls all of the major industries? It isn't. And that's an interesting time period where America gladly held over the reins to this socialist concept that Karl Marx had alluded to as the step towards communism. So we'll leave that for another time when you get to economics next year in your senior year. So what you need to recognize or know that on the home front, we still have, we didn't need that large of a military standing army. Why? Because America was working hard to stay out of all these things. But with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt passes a law that essentially that we need to bring in countless men and women. And so you see, because of this draft and everybody having to submit their names to see who is eligible, so out of the 16 million, we have close to 12 million men and women serving. What does this do? I forget if I talk about this in subsequent PowerPoint screen, but this absolves almost all of the millions of people who were homeless and without work and were collecting benefits from the government. Now they've gone from having no income to where they are on full-time income. And this is a great thing, and we begin seeing, with the factories churning out products, we see people who are working for the military. What does this mean? The Depression has immediately just gone bye-bye like it was a bad dream, and America is driving and thriving. It also reflected that there is tremendous amount of diversity taking place that the military helped facilitate. By having and the need of over 12 million men and women join the forces, it's like the color didn't matter. If you're from the South and African American, it didn't matter. You were still brought in. Now, I'm not saying, and I'll talk about this later, that every part of the military was desegregated. It was not desegregated, but they did at least get equal opportunity for pay and opportunity to get out of, let's say the cotton fields of Alabama to now going to move to California to work in San Diego for the Marine Corps. It was really an incredible time that reflected the entire population having an opportunity to do that. For instance, they talk about the Tuskegee Airmen and how they were the all African American group that had planes that were distinguished in World War II. But what made them unique is that they were completely all African American, from the one who fixed the tires to the ones who flew the planes. And then you had the WACs and the Waves, where women were coming together and joining. They couldn't join in the fight, but they can certainly join behind the scenes, or can join working as medics in the naval, on the hospitals there. And so another thing that we also see on the home front economy is that unions were given great leverage, but the government asked them to kind of chill and keep a low profile, because we need everybody all in. And ironically, many unions at this time, if you haven't caught the drift, many of them since the late 1890s have been supported by communists asking to overthrow this bourgeoisie, rich mindset, to where the workers of the world come together. In this instance, we're going to begin seeing that Russia is soon, even though the pact they had signed in 1940 with Germany was going to be a year later, Germany was going to turn on them and then attack Russia. And when Russia was attacked, where all the birth of communism allegedly was started, this is when almost all the communists that were all pro-union and not anti-America, but were certainly pro-workers, they said, we're all in this together as well, because the union membership wants to support their comrades in Russia. It was literally all in. And so hopefully you're beginning to recognize that for the most part. So here's a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen and the women having opportunities in the workplace. Because so many men were being sent away, new opportunities for women opened up in the workforce. It wasn't just relegated to, sweeping the floors or doing clerical stuff. We're talking, women working in the factories, building and constructing the naval boats, the airplanes, the military munitions, etc. And so what made it, exciting in that regard is that they did hold strong, they did contribute, but unfortunately at the end of the war it was always expected that the last hired, first fired, that the moment the men come back, they would be expected to give up those types of jobs. Even though they've either equally or outperformed the men in their absence, that was just the double prejudice that was going on during this time. And then secondly, women who were called into work or could work, what was unique is that even married women for the first time could come in, but they struggled to find childcare. The only country at this time that offered childcare was that of Great Britain. So it came at a major disadvantage for those women who were married and with children. They could get a job, but they had to figure out what their childcare situation would look like. And here you see, not really Rosie the Riveter, but it's a very similar thing where women, are at work there, and America and the effort could not do without any of their efforts. Well, the third thing that we're going to now look at is how fighting for equality at home amongst the different, marginalized people groups. And so the first one that we're going to focus on is African Americans. We're going to talk about Japanese Americans. We're going to look at Mexican Americans, and then we're going to look about how Washington and Roosevelt, how did they respond to some of these people groups in a nutshell. So the first one I want to talk about is that of the African American community. And so they had signed up by the millions in order to participate in the war effort. Why? They did not like the message, of course, of Hitler and Nazism and this belief system or ideology that people of lesser race were lesser, and this Aryan, Anglo-Saxon type of thing. And so on one hand, they were certainly all in and fighting. Secondly, they were all about defending the American tradition, and when they bombed Pearl Harbor, this motivated them to do that. And so what happened, however, is there was a guy named Philip Randolph who went, and I don't know if I talk about him in the next slide, but William Randolph went to try and go get greater rights for African Americans who were working at home during this time. And the president basically said, as Philip Randolph was trying to organize this 100,000 men to march into D.C. and demand better pay and equal rights and equal jobs and guarantees when the war is over they can keep them. President Roosevelt saw this as kind of a political nightmare. He says quietly, hey, how about me and my wife, Eleanor, let's meet with you. And it was there that they actually passed an executive order giving them equality of jobs, but it didn't have a way to support how it was supported. There wasn't any policing agent. There wasn't no committee to come alongside and fine companies if they didn't follow through with it. So it was kind of a, on one hand, they gained some traction, and this traction will come out in subsequent years, meaning beneficial, but immediately it didn't bring about the end. So what you need to know from this time period that Phillips and this movement of men started this double V campaign. And the double V basically means, both victory on the two war fronts, against racism on the enemies and racism at home. We call this the double V. And what an incredible imagery that it had here to go on with this. And so we begin seeing that there was organizations trying to move. The core movement is taking place. And then in Detroit alone, we see these race riots occurring where at a little amusement park, there was a situation where over 34 people were killed simply because of race issues and concerns, all of this war effort, and we still are seeing this type of activity taking place amongst different groups. Now, for the Hispanic population, the Mexican population, most of them, if you please remember, are born American citizens. They were here and born, so therefore the Constitution protects them. Well, that might not be the case, as we'll see later on at the end of this as we talk about the race riots there in the zoot suits in L.A. But the America, because they were so desperate for workers. Now, remember, when FDR first came into office, he was the only president to boot out all of these Mexicans. And even if they were Mexican Americans, he still sent them south, saying, sorry, we want you to go bye-bye. We only have work for white people coming in from Oklahoma and Texas, etc. So there should have been some bitterness there. But America goes, creates this Braceros program that basically says, hey, you come and work for us. You promise to return back to Mexico, and we'll give you X amount of dollars for doing this type of thing in order to meet the shortages. What the program didn't do is to guarantee a decent housing and a decent pay and a decent work experience. And so what we discovered is that they did come to work, but all sorts of different owners of the farms, some treated them decent, some treated them horrifically. And so this is what caused them to form the LULAC Commission to begin doing labor movements and boycott movements to elevate the awareness of it. Did they pay off? Very few of them did. Very few of them were able to earn extra pay. Why? Because there would be other Mexicans coming up from the Bracero program that would just replace those that were troublemakers. And so, sadly, many American farmers were able to get away with how they were treating them. Well, we have LA as a perfect example, just like as Detroit is a case study of what happens when you are bringing in more African Americans that are new to this area and not enough work and equality for them. Let's talk about LA. Remember, LA is the fastest growing city in America at this time. Tons and billions of dollars is being sent there to build boats and to build planes and other munitions, etc. So they need more workers. And who are here? Well, a lot of Hispanic, Mexican people were already living here prior to that. But income newcomers, people from Texas, people from Oklahoma, people from all over, and they're not quite used to who these Mexican Americans are and what they represent. And so these sailors who are there thinking they're all defending American honor, they hear about these zoot suit kids. These are like alleged gangster types from East LA who dressed a cool little way with big jackets, but slender pants that are pegged at the bottom and these watches and stuff. So, they would go around, just be young kids, but some of them were maybe, punks and doing some official troublemaking, but most of them was just a fashion statement. Well, some sailors, I'm sure, were drinking a little too much, went to East LA. Why they went there, who knows? Maybe they saw some of them driving down the street, and there, whether they were in the zoot suits or not, ultimately they started creating riots there. Now, what you find interesting is I have comments there, and I'll talk about this for the Steger Select, is that, you got the race riots of Chicago, you got the Sacco and Vanzetti trial of the 1920s, and now we're seeing the same thing taking place. Where's this equality? All in. Well, all in unless you're, a marginalized person, and then America just doesn't seem to, maybe work for you in this situation. Now let's talk about the Native Americans. We have over 225,000 of them working for them, and interestingly enough, there was a tribe that actually refused to join in on the war effort against Japan. They, in fact, made their own declaration of war as an own tribe. Why? Because they are their own independent nation. Very cool. I think it was the Iroquois nation that done this type of thing. But there's a great movie called the Wind Talkers about the Navajo soldiers who were brought in and used their very, very difficult, challenging language to confuse the Japanese by sending coded signals. It's a great story. And so they were very influential in a very significant way. But also many other American Indians were, given jobs in the defense-related industries here locally. But you need to recognize that they were treated horribly and badly and with deep prejudice and racism by most of the American, most of the white people that were there working adjacent to them. So it wasn't enough to change their condition nor how they were treated. Here's a picture of the code talkers that I alleged to earlier. And then lastly, the Japanese. And we need to kind of talk a little bit about them and take a moment. The Japanese Americans, hardworking, diligent, just like the Mexican American and just like the Native American, just like the African American community. They, because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was probably a different sentiment of anger towards them than it was towards the German and Italian descents. The Germans hadn't bombed any American port. The Italians hadn't bombed any American port. Yes, they were over there killing, other people in Europe, but it was the Japanese that frankly came and did, their dastardly deed right there. And so it became quite, apparent that as the war was going to continue and we were going to declare war on Japan, that there was going to be some increased animosity towards these Japanese Americans. And so we have not only a people group of America, but we also have a presidency and a Congress that were in favor of creating internment camps, if you will, to house various Germans, Italians, and predominantly Japanese in order to protect the security of America from them. Sadly, the only group that actually was pinpointed by the president, that's Executive Order 9066, allowed people, commanders on the West Coast, to make decisions about how they want to uproot all of those Japanese there. Now remember, many of these Japanese were born here. And so they were sent. You'll see a picture here of a little girl. I think it's a little girl, child. It could be a boy, and their families being uprooted. And there's a military guy with his uniform. Kid has no idea what's going on. But can you imagine these families who have lived in, let's say, in the farming and beautiful areas outside of Los Angeles, and all of a sudden they have 1 week's notice to sell everything and pack up and go. Interestingly enough, Hawaii, they never moved the Japanese off of there because 1/3 of the island was Japanese and they needed them there to keep farming, to keep contributing to that. And so they were put on strict martial law orders there in Hawaii, but they got to stay home and contribute to the war effort this way. And so this executive order forced many Japanese American, hundreds of thousands of them, to different camps across the landscape of America. Some were in Utah, some were in Wyoming, some were in Arizona, some were in California. And these weren't concentration camps where people were forced to work and killed, etc., like we had with Germany. These were internment camps where they were given decent housing and food, and they were able to work, to come together, and they actually began, like the one outside of Bishop, if you go up 395, they began developing businesses where some were making fishing tackle and planting gardens that they sold to the local people, and butchers and different things. So they had the ability to do things to help support themselves, but it still was nothing that they had wanted to do of their own. But there was one person that we look at, and his name is Korematsu, Fred Korematsu. He was a kid born in the States. His parents were not. And his whole family was told that they had to leave. He refused. 3 weeks later, he was captured, sent to a camp, and then he was then confined to 5 years of probation for this. Well, we're going to learn more about Korematsu, Fred Korematsu versus the United States here at the end of World War II, and how he challenges this situation. Because how is it that the 14th Amendment and the rights guaranteed that the Bill of Rights would be taken simply because of a war? And so Korematsu will be a very famous person in a court case here in subsequent years. And so with that, I think we're doing good in getting to, in a nutshell, we need to be mindful that even though the ordeal for the Japanese Americans was sad and challenging, we need to recognize that the Chinese Americans seem to improve, and their not status, but their capacity to improve. What was improved? The Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed in 1943. I mean, we're talking, hundreds of years it was there, and these Chinese Americans became the first Asians who actually can become naturalized citizens. So in the other end of it, the Japanese felt the brunt of this. In this situation, we see those of Chinese descent finally getting some things. So in short, remember, America is all in, whatever it takes, all in. And that is what enabled the power of the federal government to grow and to balloon, and how most industries and people did become unified. But let's not lose sight that there were still different people groups that did not have the same opportunities and did not have equal sharing of the most of the general population in America. So keep it classy, Golden Bears. Take care.